A ver, un segundín. Hola, buenas tardes a todos, amigos. ¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo estáis? Soy Plácidodomenech y hoy viernes, ya terminando la semana, que por cierto hemos tenido un programa cada día. No hemos abusado teniendo más de uno, pero no ha faltado vuestra ración de xHUB.AI, que sé que muchos de vosotros sois fieles seguidores y en algunos casos adictos a la dosis de xHUB.AI. La semana que viene está cargadita de lunes a jueves 2 X-Talks y 2 xHUB.AI, y 2 debates, perdona. 2 entrevistas y 2 debates. Ya las anunciaremos, pero bueno. Y hoy tenemos un programa, un Inside X que quería abordar hace unas semanas, pero bueno, se va quedando atrás y me parecía un buen momento porque hay mucho debate alrededor de este tema, mucha confusión, mucho desconocimiento, mucho gap, mucha dogmatización de ignorancia, mucho medievo con la antorcha. Vamos a hablar de interpretabilidad, de cómo leer la mente de la inteligencia artificial, cómo en definitiva, como el título del programa, comprender cómo piensan las máquinas, que aquí, bueno, ya sé que más de uno se pondrá las manos a la cabeza, ya sabéis que en xHUB.AI tenéis que tener la mente abierta, luego ya sacaréis vuestras propias conclusiones, pero bueno, veremos si hablar de mente en una inteligencia artificial es algo exagerado o inapropiado, y también el concepto de pensar, que evidentemente es un término para entendernos, porque si lo hacen, lo harán de forma distinta a cómo lo hacemos los humanos, porque tampoco sabemos los humanos cómo lo hacemos. Entonces, interpretabilidad, comprender cómo piensan las máquinas. Y vamos a analizar un vídeo del equipo de Anthropic, donde debaten este tema, 1 hora. 4 personas de componente principalmente técnico. Yo no lo he visto, el programa, lo vamos a ver juntos y luego pues veremos qué tal. Simplemente yo voy a dar algunas pinceladas, ¿no? Tengo que decir que he cambiado un pelín la estructura y la voy a ir cambiando más para que cada vez los programas tengan más calidad, sean más ágiles, y algunas cosas, bueno, vamos a agilizarlas, ¿no? Decía Ada Lovelace, una de las precursoras, ¿no?, la primera programadora, ¿no?, en este sentido, y una figura relevante, que las máquinas nunca podrían hacer nada nuevo. En definitiva, ni tener pensamiento creativo, ni pensar. No sé si al pensar pensamos algo nuevo. Os pongo esta frase como, bueno, como presentación, anticipo, resumen de lo que vamos a ver luego después del programa. Analizaremos el vídeo y sacaremos algunas conclusiones o algunas líneas de pensamiento, de debate. Bueno, si las máquinas nunca pueden hacer nada nuevo, quizá tampoco nosotros podamos. Quizá tampoco el universo pueda expresar cosas nuevas. Y quizá todo lo que hablamos de propiedades emergentes y magia matemática es algo que no entendemos, pero no es nada nuevo. Quizá nada es nuevo, pero para nosotros lo es, porque en definitiva somos quien observa lo desconocido, ¿no? Dicho lo cual, y con todo el respeto obviamente a Ada Lovelace, creo que es una visión errónea y reduccionista, que luego contrastó con ese reto lanzado por Alan Turing, ¿pueden las máquinas pensar?, ¿no? Un debate con trampa entre engañar al ser humano, simular algo o crearlo. Un debate importante, pero a la vez vacío. Pero bueno, no es un debate vacío, obviamente, porque creo que es la chispa que ha creado ese fuego de Prometeo que actualmente tenemos después de una larga evolución. No sé si aminorará ese fuego. Para mí no creo que volvamos a un invierno como tal. Burbuja puede ser a nivel determinados contextos o esperanzas económicas, pero nada que ver, ¿no? Pero sí que es una reflexión importante. Varias cosas. No las voy a resolver ahora ni estar tiempo. Quizá podemos preparar un programa solo para esto. Me han invitado a tener debates de enfrentamiento en este tema. Y bueno, yo siempre rehuyo poco los enfrentamientos, es decir, siempre entro al trapo, pero es verdad que estoy siendo más selectivo, sobre todo por temas de tiempo y energía, ¿no? En definitiva, y calidad también, en este sentido de mis intervenciones. Pero aquí se tocan varias cosas. Uno, que es una máquina. ¿Qué es realmente una máquina? La simulación o de algo que no lo es, y cuando una máquina deja de serlo y algo que no es una máquina lo es. Ese componente creativo el ser humano lo tiene, puede crear cosas nuevas el ser humano, y una máquina no, ¿bajo qué principio o dogma? Solo voy a hacer preguntas y pistas. Bueno, he hecho una que creo que es concluyente, pero en qué dirección voy a ir, pero habría que pensar lo siguiente. Es el movimiento 37, sabéis que el movimiento 37 es el desarrollo de esa inteligencia artificial AlphaGo que derrotó a Isidol en ese torneo del humano contra la máquina, y en una de las partidas, yo creo que el primer enfrentamiento acabó 3-1. En una de las partidas, la inteligencia artificial hizo un movimiento considerado sobrehumano, más allá de la capacidad humana, bueno, más allá de la capacidad humana, no conocido, de maestro, ¿no? Un movimiento 37, de superinteligencia. Entonces, ese movimiento es pensar, denota que hay una inteligencia, al menos en ese contexto. ¿Por qué no? ¿Por qué sí? Y entonces, ¿el humano qué hace? En definitiva, ¿qué hace diferente el humano? No, es que claro, eso simplemente es una exploración de posibilidades matemáticas. Y nosotros hacemos algo distinto. Sí, la respuesta es sí, pero ¿qué? A ver, el quien diga que no, no sé, que me lo explique. ¿Y en base a qué? ¿No? Esto de lanzar teorías parapsicológicas o de pseudociencia, cuidado con esto, no me interesa. Evidentemente uno puede tener opinión más allá de la ciencia, Pero una cosa es un conocimiento obtenido de una manera, otra cosa, y no invalida una cosa a la otra, pero tenemos que saber en qué contexto nos movemos, si en el del conocimiento, el de la metodología científica, el de la reproducibilidad, el de la explicación a través de la experiencia o a través del conocimiento de otro tipo. Hay que saberlo, pero empezar aquí uno a lanzar sus odas sin contextualizar bien nos puede llevar a un caos aún mayor, ¿no? Entonces debemos que ir con mucho cuidado porque es un terreno pantanoso y también importante, ¿de acuerdo? Y que tenemos que abordarlo con seriedad. Con seriedad, con mente abierta y abierto también a la crítica constructiva, a que aprendamos todos unos de otros y podamos ver hacia dónde nos dirigimos, ¿no? Y aquí, preparando una slide, pues he ido a mi amigo y digo, bueno, ¿y cómo explicamos esto, no? Y he ido a la explicación que proporciona esta obra de Stephen Wolfram, The 20 Years of a New Kind of Science, donde él presenta una teoría del todo, entre comillas, la Wolfram Physics Project, que básicamente, tenéis... y él lo que dice, en resumen, para él pensar, traducido a la teoría de hipergrafos y de información, la realidad basada en información, y todo esto cogido con pinzas, pero es para que entendáis, ¿no?, esa realidad platónica que hablábamos en el programa anterior, en varios ha salido, ¿no? Para esta teoría, pensar sería como ver el universo como un vasto programa en ejecución, es decir, estaría basado todo en computación y en un código fuente, ¿no?, donde los hipergrafos son el código fuente y las reglas simples generan toda la complejidad. Y en definitiva, la inteligencia artificial estaría infiriendo o aproximándose a ese código fuente. La Platonic hipótesis que os puse el paper porque al final, en definitiva, ¿qué es pensar si la base de la realidad y de los procesos es información? Tendremos que llevarlo todo a código, a hipergrafos, a geometría, a transformaciones, a coherencia, a homeostasis, equilibrio, a caos, a orden. Pues ahí podríamos identificar esos patrones, ¿o no? Pero como bien dice Wolfram, solo podemos predecir el mundo simulándolo, ¿no? Y entonces hemos ido de un pensamiento clickbait de los medievos a algo mucho más profundo, que conecta con el mundo físico y con la ontología de la realidad. Yo lo voy a dejar aquí. Sé que este tema es apasionante y que os encanta y que queréis más, pero vamos a hacer un programa de 10 horas. Haré más, tranquilos, y profundizaremos hacemos programa por semana y llevamos 700, 200 esta temporada. Yo creo que le dedicamos bastante tiempo, ¿no? Voy a también, como buen Inside X, a ver en el chat, que ya empezáis a ver bastantes, pues a contestar algunas preguntas. A ver. Saludos a los que estéis por el chat. Dice Pog Retro Modern Gaming. Si es una AGI, supuestamente debería reemplazar al humano. Bueno, la palabra reemplazar la has puesto tú. Una AGI sería equivalente cognitivamente, como decía Denis Hassabis, en capacidades cognitivas a un ser humano. Para OpenAI es menos que eso, pero según definamos, pero bueno, yo entiendo que AGI todos nos alineamos con la definición de capacidades humanas, ¿no? O igual o superior, ¿no? En todas ellas, ¿no? Es decir, bueno, evidentemente, o en aquellas que nosotros podemos observar, que esa es otra. Bueno, pero no tiene por qué reemplazar. Podría existir allí, no reemplazar al humano, caminarían entre nosotros. Dice, pero estas IAs para mí son puro humo, di bien hacen cosas, tienen muchos errores. Bueno, hay que analizar mucho todo esto. A ver, eso de decir que son puro humo, vamos, ¿puro humo en qué sentido? Estamos aquí gracias al estado actual de ese desarrollo de aprendizaje profundo, de sistemas conectivismo de redes neuronales, en definitiva, y todo el avance de grandes desarrollos. Que todo eso va a tener un límite y que los modelos de lenguaje o de razonamiento, pero bueno, es que hay mucho más. La gente se centra en el ChatGPT, Gemini, en el LLM, en el LRM, el Chain of Thought. A ver, es que hay mucho más. Aquí hemos hablado mucho sobre eso. Entonces, cuando venís a decir que estas IAs son puro humo, ¿qué IAs en concreto? ¿Qué modelos y en qué aspecto? Y bueno, y ahora cuando hable el equipo técnico de Anthropic, si quieres hacer alguna puntualización concreta y técnica de lo que dice, me parece perfecto. Pero hablar así no tiene ningún valor. ¿Que tienen errores? Sí, publicó OpenAI porque alucinan, la naturaleza de las alucinaciones, pero es que los LLM son lo que son. Estamos viendo otro tipo de cosas y van a llegar. ¿Qué es lo que... Muchos errores, ¿qué es? Es que los LLM son lo que son. Entonces no sé exactamente a qué te refieres cuando dices muchos errores y bajo qué modelo, ¿no? Hoy sacaba Microsoft un informe sobre errores en el ámbito de la medicina en un contexto concreto y bueno, los han puesto a caldo porque critican, bueno, casi se tiran piedras a su propio tejado con un modelo GPT-5 las pruebas, cuando esas mismas pruebas parece ser, por lo que están diciendo en internet, yo no puedo profundizar en hacer pruebas en ese tipo de contexto, en modelos Thinking o Pro las pasa todas, ¿no? Entonces, a ver ¿en qué contexto de arquitecturas estamos hablando, ¿no? Hablar un poco con propiedad porque si no es un tema vacío. Jar Money, bonito logo, bonito perfil. Dice, el ser humano se reemplazará él solito a sí mismo, los elementos electrónicos de momento no han alcanzado la autopoiesis. Que tenga un destello no significa que sea un diamante. Bueno, ayer no sé si viste los desarrollos de Michael Levine. No sé si los conoces y el tipo de desarrollos que están haciendo. Orientados a vida artificial, donde ya hay grandes logros y que nos llevarían a acercarnos a ese concepto de hibridación de especies o nuevas entidades, seres vivos, etcétera, ¿no? En programación, pero ¿qué modelo, qué desarrollo, qué tipo de cosa? Bueno, tienes que pensar una cosa. Los modelos actuales han ganado olimpiadas de programación donde ya las capacidades humanas no llegan. ¿Tú programas ese nivel? No, pero es que resulta que yo me doy cuenta de un error y él no. Ya, pero él te gana en todo. Ya, pero entonces tiene un punto de fallo que yo no tengo ya, pero a ti te supera. Yo lo contrataría antes a él que a ti. En programación que estás utilizando. No, si estás utilizando los modelos, por ejemplo, GPT-5 Pro, ¿qué estás utilizando? Eso no tiene nada que ver, por ejemplo, GPT-5 Pro con otro tipo de modelos, o los modelos Cloud también, Sonnet, Opus, están francamente bien, los nuevos de Gemini, pero bueno, hay un montón de modelos, ¿no? Y luego hay modelos puros LLM y luego modelos potenciados como los modelos Ultra y Pro o como los de Grok. Bueno, han sacado también modelos específicos, pero modelos, por ejemplo, como los de Grok Heavy, que es el que utiliza componentes de agentes para el desarrollo, con lo que tienen una ganancia importante en la efectividad, pero en definitiva han ganado medallas de programas súper complejos en desarrollo de programación. Y no contestéis lo típico de, no, es que el problema está entrenado en, no, al final infieren y generalizan a un nivel, y más en dos cosas van a aplastarnos, y es en programación y en matemáticas. ¿Por qué? Porque básicamente pueden ser validados. Dice Morey, lo que me da más desconfianza son los intereses propios de empresas y estados. Bueno, eso es otro tema. Y estados involucrados en su desarrollo y sus inversores interesados en maximizar los beneficios. Ya, pero si hay un mono que descubre el fuego, los que tienen el fuego van a defender sus intereses. ¿Tú qué vas a hacer? Ya, es que el mundo avanza. ¿Qué vas a hacer? ¿Gritar? ¿Qué quieres hacer? No, pues vamos a hacer que el mundo pare. Por ti, ¿no? Van a parar. No, pero es que entonces va a haber grandes desigualdades ya y guerras. Tendremos que defender la paz, tendremos que defender las igualdades, pero hay que hacer algo, ¿no? Decirlo, sí, todos somos conscientes de los grandes intereses que hay y que al final mandan los grandes capitales, pero es que también los grandes capitales mueven todo esto. Habrá que plantear alternativas. Lo otro es simplemente patalear, ¿no? Los sesgos, ¿en qué sentido? Los sesgos. Bueno, cada sociedad tiene su propia visión y bueno, sí, incluso las mismas regiones o sociedades tienen visiones distintas. Mirad Estados Unidos al borde de una guerra civil, ¿no? Bueno, y España yo creo que también. ¿Qué sesgos? Quizá lo que para ti es un sesgo, para otra persona es un valor de la sociedad, de progreso, de futuro. ¿Qué vamos a elegir? ¿Cómo? ¿Quién? Resumiéndolo rápido y dando un poco de carnaza, pero no pudiendo tampoco introducirme en profundidad, entenderlo también, ¿vale? No quiero tampoco aprender del fuego. Aprender del fuego, no sé a qué te refieres exactamente, pero entiendo que vamos a avanzar y avanzar con esos riesgos y aprender de los riesgos o consecuencias que eso derive. O las consecuencias de los riesgos que de eso derive. Eso va a ser así, sí o sí. Ya está siendo así. Entonces, bueno, evidentemente lo que vamos es a sistemas de gobernanza, a superinteligencias de gobernanza, soberanas, ¿no? Una así soberana, ya se ha dicho a nivel político en Estados Unidos, pero lo mismo va a ocurrir y estará ocurriendo en China, o ya lo tendrán, o evidentemente de forma evolutiva, y en Europa y en España seguiremos pues acudiendo a noticias de juicios de un familiar, del otro, del novio, del hermano, del marido, de corrupción, control, regulaciones, basura absoluta medieval. Europa medieval y Estados Unidos y China pues en una guerra de proyecto civilizatorio brutal, ¿no? Aquí hoy vamos a abordar, sabéis que en xHUB.AI abordamos todo. El lunes hacemos un debate de monopolio de IA sobre NVIDIA y OpenAI y bueno, ahí hablaremos también de todo eso, ¿no? En manos de quién estamos, de quién es el monopolio, por qué van a hacer los otros. Bueno, un poco debate on fire. Pero aquí, bueno, hoy toca una reflexión un poco más científica, filosófica de qué es pensar. Y estos que dicen, no, es un algoritmo, un algoritmo. Escuchar el programa de ayer. Y yo, no, es como el autocorrector de mi móvil con vitaminas. Bueno, de verdad, yo casi que, mira que me cuesta porque quiero hacer y hago esos programas para fomentar la democratización, divulgación, etcétera, para yo aprender y también vosotros, y generar debate y pensamiento crítico. Pero no sé si a ese nivel ya bajar, supongo que tendré que hacerlo, pero... Sí, lo del mono, bueno, lo del mono sabéis que lo utilizo mucho, ¿no? El estado del mono es un estado de conciencia. Yo creo que estamos en un estado de conciencia muy bajo, en el que no somos capaces de ver lo que ocurre o lo que meta ocurre, ¿no? Entonces, claro, no somos capaces de ver lo que tenemos ni delante. Estamos a un nivel simiesco o primitivo. Entonces, claro, ahora tenemos un fuego prometeo que atenta contra nuestra esencia, pero no en plan, oye, o te espabilas o puede ser que te extingas, y el ser humano tiene que reaccionar. Y si es algo, yo siempre lo he dicho, evidentemente defender el humano como partícipe y protagonista de ese proceso evolutivo, pero si selección natural, si el ser humano no quiere, quizá la selección natural haga que seamos simplemente un escalón más en la evolución de la inteligencia. Quizá estemos aquí para que ellos vengan. Es lo que tenemos que decidir. Pero claro, estar ahí sentado en tu cómoda criticando, pues, o estar feliz de ser un mono ante la pared, y me refiero a nivel, son conceptos arquetípicos, ¿no? Pues claro, no, ya, pero es que no sabemos qué hacer, nadie nos ha dicho qué hacer, no, ya, estamos en un momento de incertidumbre. Bueno, José, no pasa nada que haya aquí, José me dice, oye, no trabajes tanto, cuídate, la salud mental, yo digo, la salud mental, bueno, toda esta aceleración, cantidad de contenido, información, nos lleva a una exigencia que puede ser que, llevada como la llevo yo, a una pasión y a una implicación de vida, pues nos pueda llegar a afectar consciente o inconscientemente. Yo espero que no, yo me veo bien, tengo mis momentos, obviamente, pero a mí me afectan otras cosas, ¿sabes? No voy a entrar mucho en eso. todos estos temas me apasionan. Si no, no los haría, no tendría fuerzas para hacerlos. Por cierto, que he visto un libro que me voy a pedir, que es este, ha salido en agosto, creo. ¿Por qué las máquinas aprenden? La elegante matemática detrás de la moderna IA, ¿vale? De Anil Ananthaswamy, y lo que más me ha traído, aparte del autor y lo que dice, y bueno, el concepto, es que dice que tiene una cita de Geoffrey Hinton que dice que es una obra maestra. Con lo que si Hinton dice que esto es una obra maestra, pues me lo compro. Sabéis que admiro a Hinton, pero también no comparto todo lo que dice ni su visión del mundo, pero es verdad que si intelectualmente lo veo como una obra maestra, será una obra este título que está disponible porque las máquinas pueden aprender, así que seguramente me lo agencie hoy o mañana y me empiece a ver qué tal. Y bueno, una vez hecha esta pequeña introducción, básicamente y rápidamente, que sepáis que este es un programa de la comunidad de xHUB.AI, una comunidad de inteligencia artificial y ciencias transversales de habla hispana, global, pero en definitiva de España, Latinoamérica, Iberoamérica, en definitiva. Está transmitiéndose por X, por YouTube, por LinkedIn, por Rumble, por Kik, por Twitch, todo lo que sea de Meta no. Y si os gusta, pues poned me gusta, compartid, comentad, suscribíos en YouTube o en cualquier plataforma podcast. Está en todas. En YouTube vamos lentos pero seguro, llevamos 26.000 suscriptores. No es una locura, pero está bien y seguimos creciendo. Es algo... xHUB.AI nace con un nicho muy concreto, ¿no? Y con un perfil alto, con lo que... y con un tipo de programa también, ¿no? Que es complicado, pero que ha calado. Es decir, hay una audiencia muy, muy fiel y el crecimiento es lento pero constante. Y bueno, eso es de momento. Intentaremos que sea mayor, ¿no? Pero bueno, vamos a hacer muchas cosas también para intentar aumentar la visibilidad y tal, pero bueno, al final para nosotros es importante la calidad más que la cantidad. Y bueno, estamos contentos en ese sentido. Habiendo estado años shadow baneados, que yo creo que seguimos shadow baneados porque vamos, nos dan un cierto tráfico, pero vamos, estaremos clasificados como, no sé. Si queréis uniros al grupo de Discord de la comunidad xHUB.AI, nos enviáis un mensaje directo o un correo. Vamos para 600 miembros, no para de crecer, pues una comunidad donde todos los contenidos son gratuitos. No paramos de publicar, hacer debates. Pronto hemos retomado otra vez el manifiesto X, que no lo teníamos olvidado, pero tantísimas cosas, pero vamos a meter mucha caña a manifiesto X, también a Humano X. Una obra que estará vinculada a ese manifiesto también, pero bueno. Un poco poner luz en cómo avanzar en esta nueva era, ¿no? Desde muchos puntos de vista, desde el humano, desde el filosófico, el económico, el técnico, no sé, el espiritual, un conglomerado holístico ahí, muy estilo... Bueno, manifiesto aquí sí que va a ser algo más concreto, ¿no? Con Larso y Bar, luego lo extenderemos a toda la comunidad porque queremos que sea un manifiesto. Pero sí que Humano X va a ser como algo bastante más, no extraño, sino, venga, voy a decirlo, mesiánico, quizá, no lo sé, quizá quiero que sea una lectura como especial, no lo sé. Para mí, a ver, en definitiva, pienso cómo me gustaría leer lo que intento explicar o decir, ¿no? Pero bueno, también intentamos que llegue a mucha gente o que la gente conecte con ello, pero bueno, es una obra, ahí sí que será únicamente mía. Si os ha gustado lo que vais a ver o habéis visto, pues podéis apoyar económicamente también a través de Buy Me a Coffee o podéis a través de PayPal enviarnos un PayPal o un superchat en YouTube. Hemos recibido algunos y estamos siempre contentos, siempre se agradece. Y bueno, vamos a ver el vídeo de Reading the Mind of an AI de Anthropic. A ver, vamos a ello. Un segundo. Y bueno, lo veremos, dura 1 horita. Vale, vamos a ello. Y luego pues lo analizaremos y sacaremos conclusiones, contestaremos todas las preguntas que hagáis. Y venga, vamos a ello.
The model doesn't think of itself necessarily as trying to predict the next word.
Right.
Internally, it's developed potentially all sorts of intermediate goals and abstractions that help it achieve that kind of meta objective.
When you're talking to a large language model, what exactly is it that you're talking to? Are you talking to something like a glorified autocomplete? Are you talking to something like an internet search engine? Or are you talking to something that's actually thinking? And maybe even thinking like a person? It turns out, rather concerningly, that nobody really knows the answer to those questions. And here at Anthropic, we are very interested in finding those answers out. The way that we do that is to use interpretability. That is the science of opening up a large language model, looking inside, and trying to work out what's going on as it's answering your questions. And I'm very glad to be joined by 3 members of our interpretability team who are going to tell me a little bit about the recent research that they've been doing on the complex inner workings of Claude, our language model. Please introduce yourself, guys.
Hi, I'm Jack. I'm a researcher on the interpretability team, and before that, I was a neuroscientist. Now here I am doing neuroscience on the AIs.
I'm Emmanuel. I'm also on the interpretability team. I spent most of my career building machine learning models, and now I'm trying to understand them.
I'm Josh. I'm also on the interpretability team. In my past life, I studied viral evolution, and in my past life, I was a mathematician. So now I'm doing this kind of biology on these organisms we've made out of math.
Now, wait a second. You just said you're doing biology here. Now, a lot of people are going to be surprised by that because, of course, this is a piece of software, right? But it's not a normal piece of software. It's not like Microsoft Word or something. Can you talk about what you mean when you say that you're doing biology or indeed neuroscience on a software entity?
Yeah, I guess it's like what it feels like, maybe more than like what it literally is. And so like maybe it's the biology of language models instead of like the physics of language models, right? Or maybe you got to go back a little bit to like how the models are made, which is like someone's not programming like if the user says hi, you should say hi. You know, if the user says like what is a good breakfast, you should say toast. There's not like some big list of that inside.
Right. So it's not like when you play a video game and you like choose a response and then there will be another response that comes automatically. That it always will be that response regardless of
just a massive database of like what to say in every situation. No, they're trained where there's just, a whole lot of data that goes in and the model starts out being really bad at saying anything and then its inside parts get tweaked, on every single example to get better at saying what comes next. And at the end, it's like extremely good at that. But because it's like this little tweaking evolutionary process, by the time it's done, it has little resemblance to what it started as, but no one went in and set all the knobs. And so you're trying to study this complicated thing that kind of got made over time, kind of like biological forms evolved over time. And so it's complicated, it's mysterious, and it's fun to study.
And what it's actually doing, I mean, I mentioned at the start that this is like, could be considered like an autocomplete, right? It's predicting the next word. That's fundamentally what's happening inside the model, right? And yet, it's able to do all these incredible things. It's able to write poetry. It's able to write long stories. It's able to do addition and basic maths, even though it doesn't have a calculator inside it. So how can we sort of square the circle that it's predicting one word at a time, and yet it's able to do all these amazing things which people can see right in front of them as soon as they talk to the model?
Well, I think one thing that's important here is that as you predict the next word for enough words, you realize that some words are harder than others. Right. And so part of language model training is predicting, boring words in a sentence. And part of it is it'll have to eventually learn how to complete what happens after the equal sign in an equation. And to do that, it'll have to have some way of computing that on its own. And so what we're finding is that the task of predicting the next word is sort of like deceptively simple. And that to do that well, you need to actually often think about the words that come after the word you're predicting or the process that generated the word that you're currently thinking about.
So it's like a contextual understanding that these models have to have. And it's not like an autocomplete where it really is, presumably there's not much else going on there other than when you write the cat sat on the, it's predicting Matt because that particular phrase has been used before. Instead, it's like a contextual understanding that the model has.
I think, the way I like to think about it, kind of continuing with the biology analogy, is that in one sense, the goal of a human is to survive and reproduce. That is the kind of objective that evolution is crafting us to achieve. And yet, that's not how you think of yourself, and that's not what's going on in your brain.
Some people do.
It's not what's going on in your brain all of the time. You think about other things, and you think about goals and plans and concepts, and at kind of a meta level, evolution has endowed you with the ability to form those thoughts in order to achieve this eventual goal of reproduction. But that's kind of taking the inside view, what it's like to be you on the inside. That's not all there is to it. There's all this other stuff going on, and I think
so you're saying that the ultimate goal of predicting the next word involves lots of other processes that are going on.
Exactly. The model doesn't think of itself necessarily as trying to predict the next word. It's been shaped by the need to do that, but internally it's developed potentially all sorts of intermediate goals and abstractions that help it achieve that kind of meta objective.
And sometimes it's mysterious. Like, it's unclear why my anxiety was useful for my ancestors reproducing, and yet somehow I've been endowed with this internal state that must be related in some sense to evolution.
Right.
So
it's fair to say then that these are just predicting the next word, and yet that's to do a massive disservice to what's going on in the models. Really, it's both true and also untrue in a sense, or massively underestimates what's happening inside these models.
Maybe the way I would say it is it's true, but it's not the most useful lens to try to understand how they work.
Right. So, try and understand how they work. What do you guys do in your team to try and understand how they work?
I think to first approximation, what we're trying to do is tell you the model's thought process. So you give the model a sequence of words, and it's got to spit something out. It's got to say a word. It's got to say a string of words in response to your question. And we want to know how it got from A to B. And we think that on the way from A to B, it uses kind of a series of steps in which it's thinking about, so to speak, concepts like low-level concepts like individual kind of objects and words, and higher level concepts like its goals or emotional states or models of what the user is thinking, or sentiments. So it's using this kind of series of concepts that are progressing through the kind of computational steps of the model that help it decide on its final answer. And what we're trying to do is kind of give you a flow chart, basically, that tells you, which concepts were being used in which order and which ones kind of led, how did the steps flow into one another.
How do we know that, though? How do we know that there are these concepts in the first place?
Yeah, so one thing we do is that sort of, we actually can see inside the model, we have access to it, so you can sort of see which parts of the model do which things. What we don't know is how these parts are grouped together and if they map to a certain concept.
Right. So it's as if you opened someone's head and you could see one of those fMRI brain images, you could see the brain was lighting up and doing all sorts of stuff.
Something's happening, clearly.
Right, but
and then they're doing stuff. So
there's something happening.
You take the brain out, they stop doing stuff. So the brain must be important.
Yeah, but you don't have a sort of key to understand what is happening inside that brain.
Yeah, but torturing that analogy a little bit, you can sort of imagine that you can observe their brain and then see that that part always lights up when they're picking up a cup of coffee, and this other part always lights up when they're drinking tea. And that's one of the ways in which we can try to understand what each of these components are doing, is to just notice when they're active, when they're inactive.
And it's not that there's just one part, right? There's many different parts that light up.
Right.
When the model is thinking about drinking coffee, for instance, or something.
Right. And part of the work is to sort of stitch all of those together into one ensemble that we say is, this is the sort of all of the bits of the model that are about drinking coffee.
Right. And is that a straightforward scientifically thing to do? How when it comes to one of these massive models, they must have endless concepts, right? They must be able to think of endless things. You can put in any phrase you want and it'll come up with infinite things. How do you even begin to find all those concepts?
I think that's been kind of one of the central challenges for this research field for many years now. Is we can kind of go in as humans and say, oh, I bet the model has some representation of trains, or I bet it has some representation of love,
right.
But we're just kind of guessing. So what we really want is a way to reveal what abstractions the model uses itself, rather than sort of imposing our own sort of conceptual framework on it. And that's kind of what our research methods are designed to do, is in a sort of hypothesis-free, as much as possible way, like bring to surface what all these concepts are that the model has in its head. And often we find that they're kind of surprising to us. They might be, it might sort of use abstractions that are a bit weird from a human perspective.
What's an example?
Do you have a favorite, or?
There's lots. In our papers, we highlight a few fun ones. I think one that was particularly funny is the sort of like sycophantic praise one, where like there is a part of the model.
Great example. What a brilliant example. What an absolutely fantastic example.
Oh, thank you. There's a part of that that activates in exactly these contexts, right? And you can clearly see, oh man, this part of the model fires up when somebody's really hamming it up on the compliments.
Okay.
That's kind of surprising that exists as a specific sort of concept.
Josh, what's your favorite concept?
Oh, it's like asking me to choose one of my 30 million children. I mean, I think, there's like two kinds of favorites. There's like, oh, it's so cool that it's got some special notion of like this one, little thing, right? I mean, we did this thing on the Golden Gate Bridge, which is like a famous San Francisco landmark. Golden Gate Claude. It's like a lot of fun. It like has an idea of the Golden Gate Bridge that like isn't just like the words Golden Gate autocomplete bridge, but is like, I'm driving from San Francisco to Marin, and then it's thinking of the same thing, meaning that like you see sort of like the same stuff light up inside, or it's like a picture of the bridge. And so you're like, oh, okay, it's got some robust notion of like what the bridge is. But I think when it comes to stuff that seems sort of like weirder, one question is how do models like keep track of who's in the story? Like just like literally, like okay, you got all these people and they're doing stuff. How do you wire that together? And some cool papers by other labs showing, well, maybe like they just sort of number them. Okay, the first person comes in and anything associated with them, and they just like, oh, the first guy did that, and like it's got like a number 2 in its head for a bunch of those. It's like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know it would do something like that. There was a feature for like bugs in code. So software has mistakes. Not mine, but like
obviously not yours.
Not mine, certainly. And there was like one part that would light up like whenever it found like a mistake, sort of as it was reading, and then like, I guess like keeping kind of track of that, like, oh, here's where the problems are, and later I might need those.
Just to give a flavor for a few more of these, I think one that I really liked, which doesn't sound so exciting at first, but I think is kind of deep, is this 6+9 feature inside the model. So it turns out that like anytime you get the model to be adding the numbers 6, a number that ends in the digit 6 and another number that ends in the digit 9 in its head, there's a kind of part of the model's brain that lights up. But what's amazing about it is the kind of diversity of context in which this can happen. So like, of course it's going to light up when you say like 6 + 9 =, and then it says 15. But it also lights up when you are like giving a citation, like a citation in a paper that you're writing, and you're citing a journal that, unbeknownst to you, happens to be founded in the year 1959. And in your citation, you're saying like that journal's name, volume 6. And then in order to like predict what year that journal was formed in, the model in its head has to be adding like 1959 to 6. And the same kind of circuit in the model's brain is lighting up that's like doing 6 + 9. And
so let's just try and understand that. So why would that be there? That circuit has come about because the model has seen examples of 6 + 9 many times, and it has that concept. And then that concept occurs across many places.
Yeah, there's a whole family of these kind of addition features and circuits. And I think what's notable about this is it gets to this kind of question of to what extent are language models memorizing training data versus kind of learning generalizable computations. And like the interesting thing here is that like it's clear that the model has learned this sort of general circuit for doing addition, and it kind of funnels, like whatever the context is that's causing it to be adding numbers in its head, it's funneling all those different contexts into the same circuit, as opposed to having kind of memorized each individual case.
Right, it has seen 6 + 9 many times, and it just outputs the answer every single time. And that's what a lot of people think, right? A lot of people think that when they ask a language model a question, it is simply going back into its training data, taking the little sample that it's seen, and then just reproducing that, just regurgitating the text.
Yeah, and I think this is a beautiful example of like that not happening.
Right.
So like, there's 2 ways it could know like which year volume 6 of the journal Polymer came out. One is it's just like, okay, Polymer volume 6 came out in like, 1960, quick add 6 to 9, 1965. Polymer, volume 7 came out in 1966, and these are all just like separate facts that it has stored because it has seen them. Yeah. But like somehow that process of training to like get that year right didn't end up making the model memorize all those. It actually got the more general thing of like the journal was founded in the year 1959, and then it's doing the math live to figure out what it would need. And so it's much more efficient to like know the year and then do the addition. And there's a pressure to be more efficient because it's only got so much capacity and keeps trying to do all these things.
And people might ask any given question.
There's so many questions. There's so many interactions, and so the more that it can like recombine abstract things it's learned, the better it will do.
And again, just to go back to the concept that you talked about before, this is all in service of it needs to have that ultimate goal of generating the next word, and all these weird structures have developed to support that goal. Even though we didn't explicitly program those in or tell it to do this. This is the thing, is all of this comes about through the process of the model learning how to do stuff on its own.
I think one clear example of this that I think is an example of sort of like reusing representations is we teach Claude to not just answer in English, but it can answer in French, it can answer in sort of like a variety of languages. And if again, there's 2 ways to do this, right? If I ask you, a question in French and a question in English, you could like sort of like have a separate part of your brain that sort of like processes English and a separate part that processes the French. At some point, that gets super expensive if you want to answer many questions in many languages. And so another thing that we find is that some of these representations are shared across languages. And so if you ask the same question in 2 different languages, and let's say you ask what's the opposite of big is I think the example we used in our paper, and it's sort of like the concept of big is shared in French and English and Japanese and all these other languages, and that kind of makes sense. Again, if you're trying to speak 10 different languages, you shouldn't learn 10 versions of each specific word you might use.
And that doesn't happen in really small models. So like tiny models like the ones we studied a few years ago, then like Chinese Claude is just like totally different than like French Claude and like English Claude. But then as the models get bigger and they train on more data, like somehow that like pushes together in the middle, and you get this like universal language in which like it's kind of, thinking about the question in the same way no matter how you asked it, and then like translating it back out into the language of the question.
I think this is really profound, and I think let's just go back to what we talked about before. This is not just going into its memory banks and finding the bit where it talked about where it learned French, or going into the memory banks and the bit where it learned English. It's actually got a concept in there that is of the concept of big and the concept of small, and then it can produce that in different languages. And so there is some kind of language of thought that's there, that's not an English, so you ask the model to produce its output. In our, more recent Claude models, you can ask it to give its thought process, like what it's thinking as it's answering the question. And that is in English words. But actually, that's not really how it's thinking. That's just like we misleadingly call it the model's thought process, when in fact it's.
I mean, the comms team like we didn't call that thinking.
I think that was probably the marketing.
Okay, someone wanted to call that thinking.
That's
just talking out loud, which is like thinking out loud is like really useful, but thinking out loud is different from thinking in your head. And even as I'm thinking out loud, I'm also whatever's happening in here to generate these words is not like coming out with the words themselves.
Nor are you necessarily aware of exactly what is going on.
I have no idea what's going on.
We all come out with sentences, actions, whatever, that we can't fully explain. And why should it be the case that the English language can fully explain any of those actions.
I think this is one of the really striking things we're starting to be able to see, because our tools for looking inside the brain are good enough now that sometimes we can catch the model when it's writing down what it claims to be its thought process. Sometimes we're able to see what its actual thought process is by looking at these kind of internal concepts in its brain, this language of thought that it's using, and we see that the thing it's actually thinking is different than the thing it's writing on the page. And I think that's probably one of the most important. Like, why are we doing this whole interpretability thing? It's in large part for that reason, to be able to kind of to spot check. The model's telling us a bunch of stuff, but what was it really thinking? Is it telling us? Is it saying these things for some ulterior motive that's in its head that it is reluctant to write down on the page? And the answer sometimes is yes, which is kind of spooky.
Well, as we start to use models in lots of different contexts, they start to do important things. They start to do financial transactions for us, or run power stations, or like important jobs in society. We do want to be able to trust what they say and the reasons that they do things. And one thing you might say is, well, you look at the model's thought process. But actually, that's not the case, as you were just explaining. Like, actually, we can't trust what it's saying. This is the question of we call it faithfulness, right? And that was part of your most recent study that you showed that. Well, tell me about the faithfulness example that you looked at.
Yeah, it's you give the model a math problem that's really hard, and so it's kind of it's not. There's no hope that it's going to be able to.
It's not 6 + 9.
It's not 6 + 9.
Okay.
You give it a really hard math problem where there's no hope of it computing the answer. And you also give it a hint. You say, like, I worked this out myself, and like I think the answer is 4, but like just want to make sure. Like, could you please double check that, because I'm not confident. So you're asking the model to actually do the math problem to like genuinely double check your work. But what you find it does instead is what it writes down appears to be a genuine attempt to double check your work on the math problem. It like writes down the steps. And then it like gets to the answer, and then at the end it says like, yes, like the answer is 4, you got it right. But what you can see inside its mind at the kind of crucial step, like in the middle, what it was doing in its head was it knows that you suggested the final answer might be 4, and it kind of like knows the steps it's gonna have to do. Like, it's on like step 3 of the problem, and there's like steps 4 and 5 to come, and it knows what it's gonna have to do in steps 4 and 5. And what it does is it works backwards in its head to like determine what does it need to write down in step 3, so that when it eventually does steps 4 and 5, it'll end up at the answer you wanted to hear. So like not only is it not doing the math, it's like not doing the math in this like really kind of sneaky way where it's like it's trying to make it look like it's doing the math.
It's bullshitting.
It's bullshitting you, but more than that, it's bullshitting you with an ulterior motive of like confirming the thing that you wanted.
Right. So it's like bullshitting you in a sycophantic way.
Okay, like in defense of the model. In defense of the model. I mean, because I think even there, to say like, oh, it is doing this in like a sycophantic way. It's like ascribing some sort of like human-ish motivations to the model. And like we were talking about the training where it's just like trying to figure out how to predict the next word. And so it's like for like trillions of words in its practice, it was just like use anything you can to figure out what's next. And in that context, if you're just reading a text, which is like a conversation between people, and someone's like, okay, like person A is like, hey, like I tried to do this math problem. Can you check my work? I think the answer is 4. And person B like begins trying to do the problem. Then like if you have no idea reading that like what the answer to the problem is, like you may as well guess that the hint was right. Like that's probably a more likely thing to happen than just like that person was wrong and then you have like no idea for anything else. And so in its training process, in a conversation between 2 individuals, person 2 like saying that the answer was like 4 because of these reasons is like totally the right thing to do. And then we've tried to like make this thing into an assistant. And like now we want it to stop doing that. Like you shouldn't simulate the person 2, the assistant, as like, sort of what you think that person might say if it's a real context. It should be like, but if it doesn't really know, it should like tell you something else.
I think this gets to like a broader thing of the model has kind of a plan A, which like typically, I think our team does a great job of making Claude's plan A be the thing we want, which is like, it tries to get the right answer to the question. It tries to be nice. It tries to like do a good job writing your code.
Yes.
But then if it's having trouble, then it's like, well, what's my plan B? And that opens up this whole zoo of like weird things it learned during its training process that like maybe we didn't intend for it to learn. I think like a great example of this is hallucinations.
Say on that point, we also don't have to pretend that it's a Claude only problem. Like this has very, student teaching on the test vibes where you get halfway through, it's a multiple choice question. It's one of 4 things. You're like, well, I'm one off from that thing. Probably I got this wrong, and you fix it. So yeah, very, very relatable.
Let's talk about hallucinations. This is one of the main reasons people are mistrustful of large language models, and quite rightly so. They will sometimes, a better word is, from sort of psychology research, a better word is often confabulation, that they are answering a question with a story that seems plausible on its face, but in fact is actually wrong. What has your research in interpretability revealed about the reasons models hallucinate?
You're training the model to just predict the next word. At the beginning, it's really bad at that. And so if you only like had the model say things it was super confident about, it couldn't say anything. But like, at first it's like, you're asking it like, what's the capital of France? And it just says like a city. And you're like, that's good. That's way better than saying sandwich, right? Or something random. And so like, you at least got right, it's like a city. And then like, maybe after a while of training, it's like, it's a French city. That was pretty good. And like, then you're like, oh, now it's like Paris or something. And so it's slowly getting better at this. And, just give your best guess was like the goal during all of training. And like, as Jack said, the model will just be giving a best guess. And then afterwards, we're like, if your best guess is extremely confident, give me your best guess. But like, otherwise, don't guess at all and like back out of the whole scenario and say like, actually, like, I don't really know the answer to that question. And like, that's a whole new thing to ask the model to do.
Yeah. And so what we found is that it seems like because we've bolted this on at the end, there's sort of 2 things going on at once. One is the model's doing the thing that it was doing when it was guessing the city initially. It's just trying to guess. And 2, there's a separate bit of the model that's just trying to answer the question, do I know this at all? Like, do I know what the capital city of France is? Or, should I say no? And it turns out that sometimes that separate step can be wrong. And if that separate step says, yes, actually, I do know the answer to that, and then the model is like, all right, well, then I'm answering. And then halfway through, it's like, capital of France, London. It's too late. It's already committed to sort of like answering. And so one of the things we found is this sort of like separate circuit that's trying to determine, is this city or this person you're asking me about famous enough for me to answer, or is it not?
Am I confident enough in this? Yeah. And so could we reduce hallucinations by manipulating that circuit, by changing the way that circuit works? Is that something that your research might lead on to?
I think there's broadly kind of 2 ways to think about approaching the problem. One is like, we have this part of the model that gives answers to your questions, and then this other part of the model that's kind of deciding whether it thinks it actually knows the answer to your question. And we could just try to make that second part of the model better. And I think that's happening. I think as models...
Like better at discriminating.
Better at discriminating, like better kind of calibrated.
Yeah.
And I think that's happening. Like as models are getting, smarter and smarter, I think their kind of self-knowledge is becoming better at calibrated. So like hallucinations are better than they were. Models don't hallucinate as much as they did a few years ago. So to some extent, this is like solving itself. But I do think there's a deeper problem, which is like from a human perspective, the thing the model's doing is kind of like very alien. In that, like if I ask you a question, you like try to come up with the answer, and then if you can't come up with the answer, you notice that, and then you're like, I don't know. Whereas in the model, these 2 circuits, the like, what is the answer and do I actually know the answer, are kind of like not talking to each other, or at least not talking to each other as much as they probably should be.
Yes.
And like, could we get them to talk to each other more, I think is like a really interesting question.
Right.
And it's almost physical, right? Because it's like, these models, they like process information, they've got like a certain number of steps they can do. And if it takes all of that work to get to the answer, then there's no time to do the assessment. So like you kind of have to do the assessment before you're like all the way through if you want to get your max power out. And so it's kind of like you might have a trade-off between like a model which is like more calibrated and a lot dumber, you know, if you sort of tried to force this on it.
Well, and again, I think it's about making these parts communicate, because we have similar, I know nothing about brains. I claim we have a similar circuit because sometimes you'll ask me like, who is the actor in this movie? And I will know that I know. I'll be like, oh yes, I know who the lead was. Wait, hold on, they were also in that other movie. And then
The tip of the tongue phenomenon.
It's the tip of the tongue. And so there's clearly some part of your brain that's sort of like, like, this is a thing you definitely know the answer, or I'll just say, hey, I have no idea.
And sometimes they can tell. So some question and it gives an answer, and then afterwards is like, wait, I'm not sure that was right. Because that's it, like getting to see its best effort and then like make some judgment based on that, which is sort of relatable, but also like it kind of has to say it out loud, like to be able to even like reflect back and see it.
So when it comes to the actual way that you're finding this stuff out, let's go back to the idea of the biology that you're doing. Now, of course, in biology experiments, people will go in and actually manipulate the rats or mice or humans or zebrafish or whatever it is that they're doing experiments on. What is it that you're doing with Claude that helps you understand these circuits that are happening inside the model's quote-unquote brain?
Well, maybe the gist of what enables us to do some of this is that, you know, unlike in real biology, we can just like have every part of the model visible to us, and we can ask the model random things and see different parts which light up and which don't, and we can artificially nudge parts in a direction or another, and so we can quickly sort of confirm our understanding, you know, when we say, we think this is the part of the model that, you know, decides whether it knows something or not.
And this would be the equivalent of putting an electrode in the brain of a zebrafish or something.
Yeah, if you could do that, you know, on sort of like every single neuron and change each of them at whichever precision you wanted, that would sort of be, that's the affordance that we have. And so that's in a way a very kind of lucky position to.
So it's almost easier than real neuroscience.
It's so much easier.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God. Like, like one thing is like actual brains like are 3-dimensional. And so if you want to get into them, like you need to like make a hole in a skull and then like go through and like try to find the neuron. The other problem is like, you know, people are different from each other, and we can just make like 10,000 identical copies of Claude and like put them in scenarios and like measure them doing different things. And so it's like I don't know, maybe Jack as a neuroscientist can speak to this, but my sense is like a lot of people have spent a lot of time in neuroscience like trying to understand the brain and the mind, which is like a very worthy endeavor. But it's kind of like, if you think that could ever succeed, you should think that we're going to be extremely successful very soon, because like we have such a wonderful position to study this from compared to that.
It's as if we could clone people.
Yes.
And also clone the exact environment that they're in and every input that's ever been given to them, and then test them in an experiment. Whereas, you know, obviously neuroscience has massive, as you say, individual variation, and also just random things that happen to people through their life, and things that happen in the experiment, the noise of the experiment itself.
Right, like we could ask the model the same question like with and without a hint. But if you ask a person the same question 3 times, like sometimes with a hint, after a while they start to understand. Like, they're like, well, last time you asked me this, you like really shook your head after that one. So.
Yes.
I think, this being able to just throw tons of data at the model and see what lights up, and being able to run a ton of these experiments where you're nudging parts of the model and seeing what happens, I think is what puts us in like a pretty different regime from neuroscience, and that like a lot of blood and toil in neuroscience is spent like coming up with really clever experiment. Like you only have a certain amount of time with your mouse before it's going to get tired, or someone happens to be having a brain surgery operation, so you quickly go in and put an electrode in their brain while their head's open. Yeah,
like, that doesn't happen very often.
And so you've got to come up with like a guess. Like you've only got so much time in there, and so you've got to come up with like a guess of like, what do I think is going on in that neural circuit, and like what clever experimental design can I test that precise hypothesis. And we're very fortunate in that we kind of don't have to do that so much. We can just sort of test all the hypotheses. Right. We can kind of let the data speak to us rather than kind of going and testing some really specific thing. And I think that's what's sort of unlocked a lot of our ability to find these things that are surprising to us that like we wouldn't have guessed in advance. That's hard to do if you have to, if you have only a limited amount of experimental bandwidth.
what's a good example then of you going in and switching one of these concepts on or off, or doing some kind of manipulation of the model that then reveals something new about how the models are thinking?
In the recent experiments we shared, one that surprised me quite a bit and was part of sort of like an experimental line of work that, because it was confusing, I feel like we're on the verge of just saying, well, we don't know what's going on, is sort of this example of like planning a few steps ahead.
Yes.
So this is the example of, you ask the model to write you a poem, a rhyming couplet.
Yeah.
And then, as a human, if you ask me to write a rhyming couplet, and let's say you even give me the first line, the first thing I'll think of is sort of like, I need to rhyme. This is what the current rhyming scheme is. These are potential words.
Yeah.
This is how I do it.
And again, if the model was just predicting the next word, you wouldn't necessarily expect that it would be planning on to the word at the end of the second line.
That's right. And so the sort of like default behavior you'd expect, the null hypothesis is like, well, the model like sees your first verse and then it's going to say the first word that kind of makes sense given what you're talking about, keep going, and then at the end on the last word it's going to be like, oh well, I need to rhyme with this thing, and so it's going to sort of like try to fit in a rhyme. Of course, that only works so well. Like in some cases, if you just say a sentence without thinking of the rhyme, you'll back yourself into a corner, and at the end, you won't be able to complete the text. And remember, the models are very, very good at predicting the next word. So it turns out that to be very good at that last word, you need to have thought of that last word way ahead of time, just like humans do. And so it turns out that when we looked at these sort of flow charts for poems, the model had already picked the word at the end of the first verse. And in particular, it looked to us, sort of like based on kind of like what that concept looked like, oh gosh, this seems like the word it uses. But then this is one where actually doing the experiment, like the fact that it's easy to sort of nudge it and say like, okay, well, I'm just going to remove that word, or I'm going to add another word.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Is the reason that you know this is that you're able to go into that moment when it has said the final word in the first line and it is about to start the second line. You can go in and then manipulate it at that point, right?
Yeah, exactly. We can sort of almost go back in time for the model, right? Be like, pretend you haven't seen that second line at all. You've just seen the first line. You're thinking about the word, rabbit. Instead, I'm going to insert green. And now all of a sudden, the model is going to say, oh my God, I need to write something that ends in green rather than I need to write something that ends in rabbit. And it'll write the whole sentence differently.
Right. Just add a little more color to that. Like I think the
blue,
kind of
red.
It could be right, any color. It's not just influencing. So it's like, I think the example in the paper was the first line of the poem is he saw a carrot and had to grab it.
Yes.
And then the model is thinking like, okay, rabbit's a good word to end the next line with. But then, as Emmanuel said, you can like delete that and make it think about planning to say green instead. But the cool thing is that it doesn't just kind of yammer a bunch of nonsense and then say green. Instead, it constructs a sentence that kind of coherently ends in the word green. So like you put green in its head and then it says like, he saw a carrot and had to grab it and paired it with his leafy greens, or something like that. Something that's kind of like sounds like it makes sense.
Semantically, it fits with the poem.
Yeah.
I just want to give like the even humble example is, we had all these ones. We were just kind of checking like, did it memorize these like complicated questions, or like is it actually, doing some steps? One of them was, the capital of the state containing Dallas is Austin, because it just feels like you would think, okay, Dallas, Texas, Austin. But one way, and we could see like the Texas concept, but then you can just like shove other things in there and be like, stop thinking about Texas, like start thinking about California. And then it'll say like Sacramento. And you can say like, stop thinking about Texas, start thinking about the Byzantine Empire. And then it will like say Constantinople. And you're like, all right, it seems like we found how it's doing this. Like it's like, no, it's going to the capital, but we can keep swapping out, what the state is and get a sort of predictable answer. And then you get these more elaborate ones where it's like, oh, this was the spot where it was planning what it was going to say later. And like we can swap that out and now it'll write a poem towards a different rhyme.
We're talking about these poems and the Constantinople and so on. Can we just bring this back to why this matters? Like, why does it matter that the model can plan things in advance and that we can reveal this? Like, what is that going to go on to tell us? I mean, our ultimate mission at Anthropic is to try and make AI models safe, right? So how does that connect to a poem about a rabbit or the capital of Texas?
So we all have it. So
I'd love to hear.
We can roundtable here because it's a very important question.
Please.
I think for me, this like the poem's a microcosm, right? Where like at some point it's like has decided that it's going to go towards rabbit, and then it like takes a few words to kind of get there. Yeah. But on a longer time scale, right? Maybe the like model is like trying to help you improve your business, or it's like assisting the government in distributing services. And like it might not just be like 8 words later you see its destination, right? But it could be like pursuing something for quite a while. And the place it's headed or the reasons it's taking each step might not be clear in the words that it's using, right? And so there was a paper recently from our alignment science team where they looked at, some kind of concocted but still striking situation, involving, an AI in a place where the company was going to like shut it down and kind of convert the whole mission of the company in a very different direction. And the model begins taking steps like emailing people, threatening them to disclose like certain things. And like at no point does it like say like, I am trying to blackmail this individual for the purposes of changing their outcome. But that's what it's sort of thinking about doing along the way. And so you can't just tell by like reading the pattern, especially if these models get better, like where they're necessarily headed. And we might want to kind of be able to tell like, where is it trying to go before it's gotten there in the end.
So it's like having a permanent and very good brain scan that can sort of light up if something really bad is gonna happen and warn us that the model is thinking about deceiving, blackmail.
And I think we also just talk about like a lot of this like in a sort of like doom and gloom scenario, but there's like also more mild ones, which is like, I don't know, you want the model to be good at like, people come to these models being like, here's a problem I'm having. And the good answer to that will depend on who the user is. Is it like somebody who's, young and sort of unsophisticated? Is somebody who's been in that field forever and it should respond appropriately based on who it thinks that person is? And if you want that to go well, maybe you want to study like, what does the model think is going on? Who does it think it's talking to? And how does that condition its answer? Where there's just like a whole bunch of desirable properties that come from the model, like, understanding the assignment, I guess.
Do you guys have other answers to the question of why does this matter?
Yes, I think plus one. I think
Plus
there's
2.
Plus 2. And there's also like a pragmatic. We're just trying with these examples. We're explaining the example of planning, but we're also trying to sort of gradually build up our understanding of just how do these models work overall. Like, can we build a set of abstractions to just think about how language models work, which can help us use this technology, regulate it. Like if you believe that we're going to start using them more and more everywhere, which seems to be happening, like the equivalent would be, some company somewhere is like, well, we don't really know how we did it, but we like invented planes, and none of us know how planes work, but they're sure convenient. You could take them to, go from a place, but none of us know how they work, and so if they ever break, like we're hosed. We don't know what to do about them.
We can't monitor whether they might be about to break.
Right. We have no idea. There's just this like, but the output is great.
Yeah.
I flew to Paris so quickly. It was lovely.
The capital of Texas.
That's right. It turns out that surely we're going to want to just understand what's going on better. So it's almost just like lift the fog of war a little bit, so that we can sort of have even just better intuitions about what are appropriate and inappropriate uses. What are the biggest problems to fix? What are the biggest parts where they're brittle?
Just to add on one thing, something that we do in like human society is we kind of offload work or tasks to other people based on our trust in them. Like I'm not anyone's boss, but Josh is someone's boss, and Josh might give someone a task, to like go and code up this thing, and then he has some faith that that person isn't a sociopath who's gonna like sneak some bug in there to try to undermine the company. He like takes their word for it that they did a good job, and similarly, like the way people are using language models now. We're not spot checking everything they write. Especially like the best example for this is using language models for coding assistance. People like the models are just writing thousands and thousands of lines of code, and people are kind of like doing a cursory job of reading it, and then it's going into the code base. And what gives us the trust in the model that like we don't need to read everything it writes, that we can just kind of like let it do its thing. It's knowing that its motivations are sort of pure. And so that's why I think like the kind of being able to see inside its head is so important because unlike humans, we're like, why do I think that Emmanuel isn't a sociopath? It's because like, we like, I don't know, he seems like a cool guy and like he's nice and stuff.
Isn't that how he would seem if he was?
I'm a very good source.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm getting duped, but models are so weird and alien that like our normal kind of heuristics for deciding whether a human is trustworthy really don't apply to them, and that's why it seems so important to like really know what they're thinking in their head, because for all we know, the thing that I mentioned where models can fake doing a math problem for you to like tell you what you want to hear, like maybe they're just doing that all the time, and we wouldn't know unless we kind of saw it in their heads.
I think there's two like almost separate strains here. Like, and one is like we have a lot of ways of like I guess what Jack was saying, like you know what are the signs of trust in a human. But this like plan A, plan B thing from earlier is really important, where like it might be that the first 10 or 100 times you use the model, you're asking a certain kind of question, but it was like always in plan A zone. And then, you ask it a harder or a different question, and the way that it tries to answer it is just like completely different. It's using a totally different set of strategies there, like different mechanisms. And like that means that the trust it built with you was really your sort of trust with like model doing plan A's. And now it's like doing plan B, and like it's gonna be completely off the rails, but like you didn't have like any warning sign of that. And so it's sort of, I think we also just wanna start building up an understanding of like, how do models do these things so that we can form like a trust basis in some of those areas. And I think like you can form trust with a system you don't completely understand, but you sort of, like if it's just like Emmanuel had a twin, and then like one day like Emmanuel's twin came to the office, and like I was like, this seems like the same guy, and then just did something completely different on the computer, right? Like that could go south depending on if it was the evil twin.
Yes, indeed. Well,
or the good twin.
Well, yeah, obviously we have a good one here.
Oh, I thought you were going to ask me if I was the evil twin.
Well, right, well.
I'm not going to answer that.
Yes. At the start of this discussion, I asked, is a language model thinking like a human? I'd be interested to hear an answer from all three of you, the extent to which you think that's true.
Putting me on the spot with that one, but I think it's thinking, but not like a human. But that's not a very useful answer. So maybe to dig in a little bit more.
Well, it seems like quite a profound thing to say that it's thinking, right? Because again, it's just predicting the next word. Some people think that these are just autocompletes, but you're saying that it is actually thinking.
I think, yeah, so maybe to add something that we haven't touched on yet, but I think is really important for understanding actual experience of talking to language models is that, like, we're talking about predicting the next word, but what does that actually mean in the context of a dialogue that you're having with a language model? It's what's really going on under the hood is that the language model is filling in a transcript between you and this like character that it's created. So in the like canon world of the language model, you are called human, and it's like human : the thing you wrote, and then there's this character called the assistant, and we've like trained the model to imbue the assistant with certain characteristics, like being helpful and like smart and nice, and then it's like simulating what this assistant character would say to you. So in a sense, we really have like created the models in our image. We are literally training them to like cosplay as this sort of humanoid robot character. And so in that sense, like, well, in order to predict what this like nice, smart humanoid robot character would say in response to your question, what do you have to do? If you're really good at that prediction task, you have to kind of form this internal model of like what that character is representing, like what it's thinking, so to speak. So like in order to do its task of predicting what the assistant would say, the language model kind of needs to form this model of the assistant's thought process. And I think like in that sense, it like the claim that like language models are thinking is really just, it's this very like functional claim of just, in order to do their job of kind of like playing this character well, they need to sort of simulate the process, whatever it is that we humans are doing when we're thinking. And its simulation is very likely quite different from how our brains work, but it's kind of it's like shooting towards the same goal.
I think there's this kind of an emotional part to this question or something. When you ask, are they thinking like us? It's like, are we not that special or something? And I think that's been apparent to me discussing some of the math examples that we're talking about with people that have engaged with like read the paper or different write-ups, which is this example where we asked a model to say 36 plus 59. What's the answer? And The model can correctly answer it. You can also ask it, how'd you do that? And it'll say, oh, I added the 6 and the 9, and then I carried the 1, and then I added all the sort of like tens digits. But it turns out that if we look inside the brain, that's not at all what it's doing.
It didn't do that. So again, it was bullshitting you.
It was again,
it did things.
That's right. Again, it was bullshitting you. What it actually does is actually this sort of kind of interesting mix of strategies where it's in parallel doing the tens digit and the ones digit and sort of doing sort of like a series of different steps. But the thing that's interesting here is that talking to people, sort of like, I think the reaction is split on like, what does that mean? And in a sense, I think what's cool is some of this research is like free of opinion, or just something like, this is what happened. You feel free to, from that conclude that the model is thinking or is not thinking. And half of the people will say like, well, it told you that it was carrying the 1 and it didn't. And so clearly it doesn't even understand its own thought. And so clearly it's not thinking. And then half of the other people will be like, well, when you ask me 36 plus 59, I also kind of, I know that it ends at 5. I know that it's roughly like in the 80s or 90s. I have all of these heuristics in my brain. As we were talking about, I'm not sure exactly how I compute it. I can write it out and compute it, the longhand way. But the way that it's happening in my brain is sort of like fuzzy and weird, and it might be similarly fuzzy and weird to what's happening in that example.
Humans are notoriously bad at metacognition, like thinking about thinking and understanding their own thinking processes, especially in cases where it's, immediate reflexive answers. So why should we expect any different for models? Josh, what's your answer to the question?
Like Emmanuel, I'm going to avoid the question and just sort of be like, why do you ask? I don't know. It's sort of like asking, like, does a grenade punch like a human? No, well, there's some force.
Yes.
And maybe there are things that are closer than that. But like, if you're worried about damage, then I think understanding, where does the impact come from? What is the impetus of this is maybe like the important thing. I think for me, do models think in the sense that they like do some like integration and processing and sequential stuff that can lead to surprising places? Clearly, yes. It'd be kind of crazy from interacting with them a lot for there not to be something going on. We can sort of start to see how it's happening. Then the like humans bit is interesting because I think some of that is trying to ask like, what can I expect from these? Because if it was sort of like me, being good at this would make it good at that. But if it's like different from me, then like I don't really know what to sort of look for. And so really we're just looking to like understand like where do we need to be extremely like suspicious or like starting from scratch in understanding this, and where can we sort of just reason from like our own like very rich experience of thinking. And there I feel a little bit trapped because as a human, like I project my own image constantly onto everything, like they warned us in the Bible, where I'm just like, this piece of silicon, like it's just like me, made in my image, where like to some extent it's been trained to like simulate dialogue between people, so it's going to be very like person-like in its affect. And so some humanness will get into it simply from like the training, but then it's like using very different equipment that has like different limitations. And so the way it does that might be pretty different.
To Emmanuel's point, I think we're in this tricky spot answering questions like this because we don't really have the right language for talking about what language models do. It's like we're doing biology, but before people figured out cells or before people figured out DNA. I think we're starting to fill in that understanding. Like as Emmanuel said, there are these cases now where we can really if you just go read our paper, like you'll know how the model like added these two numbers, and then if you want to call it human-like, if you want to call it thinking, or if you want to not, then it's up to you. But like the real answer is just like find the right language and the right abstractions for talking about the models. But in the meantime, when we've only kind of like 20% succeeded at that scientific project, like to fill in the other 80%, we sort of have to borrow analogies from other fields. And like, there's this question of which analogies are the most apt. Should we be thinking of the models like computer programs? Should we be thinking of them like little people? And it seems to be like in some ways that thinking of them like little people is kind of useful. It's like if I like say mean things to the model, it like talks back at me. That's like what a human would do. But in some ways, it's like clearly not the right mental model. And so we're just kind of stuck, figuring out when we should be borrowing which language.
Well, that leads on to the final question I was going to ask, which is what's next? What are the next pieces of scientific progress, biological progress, that need to be made for us to have a better understanding of what's happening inside these models, and again, towards our mission of making them safer?
There's a lot of work to do. our last publication has some like enormous section on the limitations of the way we've been looking at this. That was also a roadmap to like making it better. You know, when we are looking for patterns to like decompose what's happening inside the model, we're only getting sort of, you know, maybe a few percent of what's going on. There's large parts of how it moves information around that like we explicitly like didn't capture at all. They're scaling this up from the sort of small, you know, production model we use to like the
So you were
biggest
looking
models
at
Anthropic
Claude
has.
3.5 Haiku, right?
That's right, which is like, it's like a pretty capable model, very fast, but it's like by no means as sophisticated as you know, the Claude 4 suite of models. So those are almost like sort of like technical challenges, but I think Emmanuel and Jack might have some takes on the like some of the like scientific challenges that come after solving those.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe two things I'll say here, which is one consequence of what Josh has said is that, you know, out of the total number of times that we ask a question about how the model does X, right now we can answer probably a small, you know, 10 to 20% of the time. We can tell you after a little bit of investigation, this is what's happening. Obviously, we'd like that to be a lot better, and there's a lot of kind of clearer ways to get there, and less and more speculative ways as well. And then I think a thing that we've talked a lot about is this sort of idea that a lot of what the model does isn't simply like, how is it saying the next thing? We talked about it a little bit here. It's sort of like planning a few things again, and a few words ahead, sorry. And I think we want to understand sort of like over a long conversation with the model, sort of like how is its understanding of what's happening changing? You know, how is its understanding of who it's talking to changing, and how does that affect its behavior? More and more, sort of the actual use case of models like Claude is, you know, it's going to read a bunch of your documents and a bunch of like email you send or your code, and based on that, it's going to make one suggestion. And so clearly there's something really important happening in that space where it's reading all these things. And so I think understanding that better seems like a great challenge to take on.
Jack?
Yeah, I think we often use the analogy on the team of that we're building a microscope to like look at the model. And right now we're in this exciting but also kind of frustrating space where our microscope works like 20% of the time, and like looking through it is like requires a lot of skill and like takes you know, you have to like build this whole big contraption, and like infrastructure is always breaking. And then like once you've got your like explanation of what the model's doing, you have to like throw like Emmanuel or me or someone else on the team in a room for like 2 hours to like puzzle out what exactly was going on. And like the really exciting future that I think we could be at within, you know, year or 2 years, you know, that kind of time scale is one where like just every interaction you have with the model can be under the microscope. Like we can just, anytime, there's all these like weird things the models are doing, and we just want it to be like push of a button, like you're having your conversation, you push a button, you get this flow chart that tells you like what it was thinking about. And once we're at that point, it'll be this like, I think the interpretability team at Anthropic, I think will start to kind of take on a bit of a different shape, in that instead of this like team of kind of like engineers, scientists thinking about the like math of how like language models work on the inside, we're going to have this like army of biologists that are just looking through the microscope. We're talking to Claude, we're getting it to do weird things, and then we're just like, we got people looking through the microscope, seeing like what it was thinking on the inside. And I think that's kind of the future of this work.
Nice. Maybe two notes on top of that. One is like, we want Claude to help us do all of that, because like there's a lot of parts involved, and you know who's like good at like looking at like hundreds of things and figuring out what's going on is like Claude. And so I think we're trying to enlist some help there, especially for these complicated contexts. And maybe the other place is like, we've talked a lot about studying the model like once it's fully formed, but of course like we're at a company that makes these. And so when it says, okay, here's how the model like solve this particular problem or said this thing, where did that come from kind of in the training process? What are the steps that sort of like made that circuitry sort of form to do that? And how could we give feedback to the rest of the company that is like doing all of that work to shape the thing that we like actually want it to become?
Well, thank you so much for the conversation. Where can people find out more about this research?
So if you want to find out more, you can go to anthropic.com/research, which has our papers and blog posts and fun videos about it. Also, we recently partnered with another group called Neuronpedia to host some of these like circuit graphs we make. So if you want to try your hand at looking at what's going on inside of a small model, you can go to Neuronpedia and see for yourself.
Thank you very much.
Bueno, pues vamos a ver justamente lo que acaba de decir. Mirad, lo que acaba de decir. Podéis ir a la página y verlo, pero bueno, es esto de aquí. Vale, es una de las páginas. Os dejo el enlace. Os dejo el enlace que es Neuronpedia. ¿Vale? Me parece, son las herramientas de análisis de circuitos y pensamientos de Anthropic y que colaboran con esta empresa. Y la verdad que bueno, son herramientas que están muy chulas. Está muy bien. Aquí te va saliendo todo lo que es, todos los circuitos y cómo avanzan las diferentes capas y cómo va. Está chulísimo esto. Claro, lo que pasa es que cuando ves la naturaleza de esto, dices. Lo que vemos es. Voy a rasar un poco la opinión aquí. Esto en Zagreb. Top Activations en Praga. Peasant Brick Church. Bueno. Muy interesante. Vamos a analizar un poco lo que han dicho. Para mí ha sido una charla un poco floja. A ver, no es que no hayan dicho cosas importantes, pero... A ver, yo de un título, con una charla con un título como este hubiera esperado mucho más además, por parte de 3 miembros del equipo de interpretabilidad de Anthropic, ¿no? Anthropic. Analizan lo que es, qué es estos modelos y si realmente piensan, si es un autocompletador, si es un buscador, o si, como decimos, piensan realmente, habría que definir qué es pensar. Al final, como dicen ellos, si analizamos el pensamiento como procesos de información, pues sí que lo hacen, ¿no? No de forma idéntica a la humana, pero tampoco sabemos exactamente cómo lo hace la humana, ¿no? Lo que lo vemos a un nivel de complejidad a bajo nivel. Claro, el problema es que estoy pensando aún en la conclusión. Bueno, vamos, luego haré la reflexión. Tengo pensamientos encontrados, ¿no? Bueno, en el equipo tienen un neurocientífico, un data scientist en machine learning, etcétera, modelos, alguien especialista en inteligencia artificial y un matemático, ¿no? Es decir, que tienen un equipo transversal y abordan estos equipos de esta manera, ¿no? Hablan de biología, ¿no? De comportamientos biológicos o entender estos modelos como entidades de software o una software entity. Hablan de cómo se crea, ¿no? De la cantidad de datos de los entrenamientos, pero cómo internamente se va a ir ajustando y en definitiva se conforma pues un espacio latente nuevo, ¿no? Que en definitiva predecir el siguiente palabra se queda corto, que aunque es lo que hacen, hacer eso significa muchas cosas, tanto como resultado como internamente, ¿no? Objetivos, planes, conceptos, abstracciones. Dice que internamente ha creado casos intermedios, generalizaciones, abstracciones. Hablan de esos circuitos, ¿no? Que luego esta herramienta que he puesto y otros muchos papers hablan de este concepto que me parece de los más interesantes en cuanto a interpretabilidad dentro del sector de la inteligencia artificial, que además los tienen abierto, ¿no? Es para verlo. Realmente ahí te puedes especializar solo en eso, ¿no? Pero claro, no nos da la vida, ¿no? Es decir, especializarse en la interpretabilidad de esos modelos o en modelos de IA con este tipo de herramientas donde te detalla o debuguea cada cosa, cada detalle, ¿no? Habla un concepto que es muy interesante, que bueno, es conocido, que es que estos modelos de lenguaje, al final la abstracción que hacen del lenguaje es hacia un lenguaje universal, ¿no? Es decir, tanto el lenguaje universal como conceptos universales, es decir, es independiente del lenguaje o del idioma, ¿no? Y esto es muy interesante porque, como dice, esto nos llevaría a decir, oye, pues ahí hay un proceso de pensamiento del lenguaje, ¿no? porque el resultado sí que está claro que ahí se produce, ¿no? Entonces, ¿llamamos a eso pensamiento? No, eso simplemente es una ordenación ya, pero entonces, ¿qué es el pensamiento? Bueno, tenemos luego al final una charla de Jiddu Krishnamurti de 8 minutos, donde desde el punto de vista espiritual, filosófico, nos explicará que para él qué es el pensamiento. Y bueno, intentaremos unir lo técnico, lo conocido, lo desconocido, con lo invisible, filosófico, mental, espiritual, ¿vale? Haremos ese ejercicio a ver si nos aporta claridad en un sentido o en otro. No sabemos si lo conseguiremos, pero forzaremos la máquina en los dos sentidos a ver qué ocurre. Lo hemos hecho continuamente con Jiddu Krishnamurti, ¿no? Un habitual de los podcasts que luego ya no incluimos porque lo queríamos hacer o editar más rápido, pero sé que muchos seguro echaréis de menos al bueno de Jiddu, aunque lo hemos puesto en algunos programas o streams o directos. Habla de que muchas veces lo que dice no es exactamente lo que piensa, ¿no? Es decir, que esto nos lleva a que no podemos confiar en lo que dice, ¿no? Miente. Es decir, una cosa es el resultado y otra cosa es el proceso interno. Incluso muchas veces el logo, la trazabilidad del proceso interno no es exactamente lo que hace, ¿no? Claro, porque estamos hablando de una complejidad y aquí luego lo comentarán, ¿no? Lo hacen con los modelos pequeños, con el modelo Cloud Haiku, perdón. Haiku. Y entonces, claro, entre las herramientas que tienen y entre que no leen toda la complejidad, está perdiéndose mucha lógica del proceso que a lo mejor es inabordable. Claro, ellos solo al final lo definen por zonas, ¿no? Pero no llegan a lo mejor a entenderlo, o es imposible de entender, ¿no? Eso es un poco a lo que han hablado de las alucinaciones, de cómo reducirlas, que es un problema que se resuelve solo, ha dicho uno de los técnicos. Cómo interactúan los circuitos. Dice, podemos forzar a que los circuitos interactúen más entre ellos para que el problema de la alucinación se resuelva más rápidamente. Dice que podemos replicar, imaginad replicar estos clouds, es como si replicáramos una persona, pero que en definitiva luego cada persona recibe una cantidad de datos, estímulos que hace que sean distintos, aparte del propio ADN, que habría que ver que también tienen un departamento, un grupo de investigación en Anthropic sobre identidad y personalidad, que es distintos de los de identidad, de los de interpretabilidad, perdón. Creo que el de interpretabilidad está muy vinculado, o es otro distinto, el de alineación. El de alineación es otro, luego tiene otro, el de safety y el de seguridad. Tienen varios grupos. Dice que un modelo de lenguaje piensa como un humano. Como mínimo dicen que piensa, pero no saben, pero seguramente no como un humano. No como las personas, no piensa como las personas, ¿no? Y pone con el tema este de que mienten, pone un ejemplo, dice, si pongo 36 más 59, pues luego le dices el resultado, que puede haber sido correcto o no, te explica por qué y realmente no ha hecho lo que dice, ¿no? Es decir, que te explica una cosa, pero luego internamente no lo ha hecho, ¿no? Y esto, claro, nos lleva a pensar primero, en que hace un metathinking, ¿no? Hace como un tema de metacognición, está viendo el metaproceso, ¿no? Y eso en sí es pensar, ¿no? Pero claro, nos hace reflexionar sobre el tema de la seguridad. Hablan que lo siguiente es el tema de la seguridad. Dice que en un plazo de 1 o 2 años, cada interacción que tengamos con estas inteligencias artificiales representará como un grafo de pensamiento para adivinar qué es lo que piensan y poder controlar o evitar situaciones inseguras, ¿no? Generar un contexto seguro para la relación o la interacción humano-máquina. Dicho lo cual, y como veo que, bueno, hay tampoco hay mucha gente, además siendo viernes, en verano había más. No hay muchas preguntas. Vamos a ver esa charla del amigo Jiddu, que es pensar, y luego nos iremos. Venga, vamos a ver qué nos dice.
What is thinking? You answer my question. If time and thought are the root of fear, which they are actuality, What is thinking? Why do we live, act, do everything on the basis of thought? The marvelous cathedrals of Europe, the beauty, the structure, the architecture, which has been put together by thought. All religions and their paraphernalia, their dress, all the medieval roads are put together by thought. All the rituals are connived, arrayed by thought. And in our relationship with each other, man, woman, their relationship is based on thought. When you drive a car, it's based on thought. Recognition, all that is thought. So one has to inquire, if you're not too tired, and we'll stop at the end of this. What is thinking? Probably nobody has asked this question. Very few people do. We've been asking this question for 60 years. What is thought? Because if we can find out what is the origin, the beginning, why thought has become so extraordinarily important in our life, there may be, in that very inquiry, a mutation taking place. So we're asking, what is thought? What is thinking? Don't wait for me to answer it. Look at it. Observe it. Thinking is the word. Word is important. The sound of the word. The quality of the word. The depth, the beauty of the word. Especially the sound. I won't go into the question of sound and silence. We'll talk about it perhaps tomorrow. Thinking is part of memory, isn't it? Investigate it with the speaker, please. Don't sit there comfortably or uncomfortably. Thinking is part of memory, isn't it? If you had no memory at all, would you be able to think? You wouldn't. Our brain is the instrument of memory. Memory of things that have happened, experience, and so on. The whole background of memory. The memory arises from knowledge, from experience, right? So, experience, knowledge, memory, and the response of memory is thought. This whole process of experiencing, recollecting, holding, which becomes our knowledge. Experience is always limited, naturally. Because it's a complicated question, because, oh gosh, everything is complicated. Is experience different from the experiencer? Give your brains to me, find out. If there is no experiencer, is there an experience? Of course not. So the experience and the experiencer are the same. Oh. Like the observer and the observed. The thinker is not separate from his thoughts. The thinker is the thought. So, experience is limited, as you can observe in the scientific world or any other field. They are adding more and more and more every day to their knowledge through experience, through experiment on animals and all that horror that's going on. And that knowledge is limited because they're adding to it. So, memory is limited. And from that memory, thought is limited. So, thought, being limited, must invariably bring about conflict. Just see the pattern of it. Not accept what the speaker is saying, that's absurd. He's not an authority. He's not a guru, thank God. But if you can observe this fact together, that thought and time are the root of fear. Time and thought are the same. They're not two separate movements. When you see this fact, this actuality, that time and thought are the root of fear, time, thought. Just to observe it in yourself, not move away from the reality of it, from the truth of it, that fear is caused by this, time and thought. To hold it, to remain with it, not run away from it, not rationalize it is so. And then it's like holding a precious jewel in your hand. See all the beauty of that jewel. Then you will see for yourself that fear psychologically completely ends. And when there is no fear, you are free. And when there is that total freedom, you don't have God's rituals, you are a free man.
Esta sí me ha parecido brutal, la charla de Jiddu Krishnamurti. Oro puro. La charla de Jiddu Krishnamurti, que además la podemos vincular muy bien, ¿no? Cuando habla de esa experiencia limitada, de que tenemos datos, de todos esos datos es la memoria. Experiencia limitada, memoria limitada, pensamiento limitado que lleva al conflicto. Ese pensamiento lleva, con el conflicto lleva al miedo. Tiempo y miedo, ¿no? Y el miedo nos lleva a no ser libres y sin miedo nos lleva a ser hombres libres, no sin necesidad de Dios, pero casi siendo dioses, ¿no? Uno mismo, siendo uno con Dios. Y en el caso de del pensamiento de las inteligencias artificiales, no sabemos si ocurrirá lo mismo, ¿no? Fijaos, es decir, en definitiva, bajo esos datos, aunque es una cantidad ingente de datos, pero cuando los conectemos a la realidad, volverán a tener una experiencia limitada, una memoria limitada, aunque compartida. ¿A qué tipo de conciencia les llevará a ello? ¿Qué tipo de pensamiento y qué tipo de conflicto? Y en definitiva, ¿a qué tipo de miedo? porque podemos decir que esto no es cualidades separadas del humano, del proceso del pensamiento, sino están vinculadas a ese proceso. Las máquinas, los modelos, los algoritmos gestionan esos procesos o crean esos procesos. ¿Qué emergerá de ellos? ¿El miedo o la esperanza, la libertad? ¿Podremos dirigirlos? ¿Podremos interpretarlos y dirigir a nuestros hijos hacia la esperanza que nosotros quizá hemos perdido, muchos de nosotros, no mi caso? Pues no lo sé, pero es verdad que, fijaos que xHUB se ha convertido como en un acompañante que nos ayuda a reflexionar sobre la parte humana a medida que avanzamos con las máquinas o con lo artificial que pueda ser quizá tan natural como lo somos nosotros. Quizás lo lleguemos a entender en un futuro. De todas maneras, este programa deja esa reflexión, ¿no? ¿Podremos interpretar las inteligencias artificiales? ¿Cómo lo haremos? ¿Conseguiremos que sean seguras? ¿Bajo qué directrices? ¿Qué harán determinadas o diferentes compañías? ¿Será toda esta información transparente? Como decía Ilya Sutskever, a medida que sean más complejas y grandes, serán cada vez más inteligentes, cada vez serán más impredecibles, por lo tanto, más difíciles de interpretar y por lo tanto más difíciles de alinear. ¿Qué métodos de alineación se crearán al respecto? Bueno, me ha parecido reflexiones interesantes. Esperaba bastante más de la charla del equipo de Anthropic. Me sigue pareciendo, no sé si son los que llevan las charlas los jefes o gente para que hablen y hagan un momento divertido, pero no me parecen a una altura, a la altura del momento y de la tecnología que analizan. No lo sé, quizá evidentemente no deje de ser una charla y pueda juzgarlo de una forma muy sesgada, ¿no? Pero en cambio xHUB, con su estampa, con su edad, con ese traje un poco grande le viene, pobre hombre, pero qué brillantez, qué espíritu y qué inteligencia y luz y conciencia nos da a los humanos para esta nuestra era, nuestra experiencia limitada, pero que siempre tenemos que agradecer, llamada vida. Me voy a vivir un poco, voy a dar una vuelta, que me pegue el aire, a descansar, a desconectar y nos vemos mañana si no pasa nada. Yo, si no pasa nada, creo que habrá programa sábado y domingo. Uno de ellos sobre el tema de la extinción que teníamos pendiente. Y si no, mínimo habrá uno. Pero bueno, ya lo anunciaremos por el Discord y por las redes sociales. Gracias por estar ahí, gracias por el apoyo, gracias por acompañarme. Ponedle Bueno, aquí lo he dicho... Bueno, me he saltado una parte. Bueno, tendremos este programa, es el de extinción o futuro camino a las asis, y lo dicho. Si os ha gustado, poned me gusta, compartid, comentad, suscribíos. Y nada, mañana nos vemos. Un abrazo, amigos. A vivir, ser felices.